Lovecraft's The Horror in the Museum is a hidden gem, a chilling journey into the truly bizarre. You clicked because you want to unearth the hidden terrors within its dusty halls, and we're about to expose every unsettling secret. Imagine a museum not of history but of pure, grotesque spectacle, life-sized wax figures so disturbing they seem almost too real. That's the Orne Museum, and Stephen Jones, a man seeking cheap thrills, finds himself drawn into its macabre allure. But what if the exhibits weren't mere curiosities, but something far, far worse, barely contained? This isn't just a plot summary. We're diving deep into Lovecraft's ingenious collaboration with Hazel Heald, exploring how they crafted a tale where ancient, cosmic horrors are disguised as mere waxworks. You'll discover the terrifying entity that lies dormant, yet terrifyingly present, among the exhibits, and how Lovecraft uses a seemingly innocuous setting to deliver truly unforgettable existential dread. The real horror isn't just what's in the museum, but what it does to those who truly see it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why The Horror in the Museum stands as a brilliant, if often overlooked, example of Lovecraftian terror. So, if you're ready to peel back the layers of this macabre masterpiece, make sure to like this video, tell us your favorite Lovecraftian creature in the comments, and subscribe for more explorations into the shadows of weird fiction. The Horror in the Museum by H.P. Lovecraft. Chapter 1. Stephen Jones first visited Rogers Museum out of simple curiosity. Someone had mentioned a peculiar underground place on Southwark Street across the river, where wax figures, far more horrifying than anything at Madame Tussauds, were displayed. So one April day he strolled in, expecting to be disappointed. Surprisingly, he wasn't. There was something truly different about this place. Of course, it contained the usual gruesome displays: Landru, Dr. Crippen, Madame Demers, Rizzio, Lady Jane Grey. There were also endless maimed victims of war and revolution, and monsters like Gilles de Rais and the Marquis de Sade. But other exhibits made him breathe faster and stay until the closing bell. The creator of this collection, he realized, was no ordinary charlatan. Some of these pieces showed real imagination, even a kind of morbid genius. Later, Jones learned about George Rogers. Rogers had once worked at Madame Tussauds, but trouble had led to his dismissal. Rumors circulated about his sanity and his strange, secret forms of worship. Yet, his success with his own basement museum had softened some criticisms, while subtly sharpening others. Rogers' hobbies were teratology, the study of monstrosities, and the iconography of nightmares. He even had the good sense to screen off some of his most unsettling figures in a special alcove for adults only. This alcove was what truly fascinated Jones. Inside were shapeless, hybrid creatures that only a disturbed imagination could conceive, molded with devilish skill and colored in a horribly lifelike manner. Some were figures from familiar myths: gorgons, chimeras, dragons, cyclops, and other frightening creatures. Others were drawn from darker, whispered legends of subterranean cycles: black, formless Tsathoggua, the many-tentacled Cthulhu, the proboscidean Shawner Fawn. There were also rumored blasphemies from forbidden books like the Necronomicon, the Book of Iban, or von Junt's Unaussprechlichen Kulten. But the worst were entirely Rogers' own creations, representing shapes no ancient tale had ever dared to suggest. Several were hideous parodies of known organic life, while others seemed lifted from feverish dreams of other planets and galaxies. The wilder paintings of Clark Ashton Smith might hint at a few, but nothing could convey the poignant, loathsome terror created by their immense size, fiendishly clever workmanship, and the diabolically effective lighting conditions. As a connoisseur of the bizarre in art, Stephen Jones sought out Rogers in the dingy office and workroom behind the museum's vaulted chamber. It was an evil-looking crypt, dimly lit by dusty, slit-like windows set horizontally in the brick wall, level with the ancient cobblestones of a hidden courtyard. Here, images were repaired and some were even made. Waxen arms, legs, heads, and torsos lay in grotesque disarray on benches. On high shelves, matted wigs, ravenous-looking teeth, and glassy, staring eyes were scattered indiscriminately. Costumes hung from hooks, and in one alcove were great piles of flesh-colored wax cakes and shelves filled with paint cans and brushes. In the center of the room, a large melting furnace, used to prepare wax for molding, stood topped by a huge iron container with a spout that allowed melted wax to be poured with the merest touch of a finger. Other things in the dismal crypt were less describable, isolated parts of problematic entities whose assembled forms were the phantoms of delirium. At one end was a heavy plank door, secured by an unusually large padlock and painted with a very peculiar symbol. Jones, who had once accessed the dreaded Necronomicon, shivered involuntarily as he recognized the symbol. This showman, he reflected, must indeed possess a disconcertingly wide knowledge of dark and dubious subjects. Roger's conversation did not disappoint him either. The man was tall, lean, and rather unkempt, with large black eyes that gazed intensely from a pallid, usually stubble-covered face. He did not resent Jones's intrusion but seemed to welcome the chance to unburden himself to an interested listener. His voice had a singular depth and resonance, harboring a repressed intensity bordering on the feverish. Jones understood why many thought him mad. With each successive visit, and these calls became a habit as weeks passed, Jones found Rogers more communicative and confidential. From the start, there had been hints of the showman's strange beliefs and practices. Later, these hints expanded into tales, whose extravagance was almost comic, despite a few odd corroborative photographs. It was sometime in June, on a night when Jones brought a bottle of good whiskey and freely plied his host, that the truly demented talk first emerged. Before that, there had been wild enough stories, accounts of mysterious trips to Tibet, the African interior, the Arabian desert, the Amazon Valley, Alaska, and certain little-known islands of the South Pacific. Rogers also claimed to have read monstrous and half-fabulous books like the prehistoric Narcotic Fragments and the Doll Chants, attributed to malign, non-human lung. But nothing in all this had been so unmistakably insane as what surfaced that June evening under the influence of the whiskey. To be direct, Rogers began making vague boasts of having found things in nature no one had discovered before, and of having brought back tangible evidence of these discoveries. According to his drunken harangue, he had gone farther than anyone else in interpreting the obscure and primal books he studied. These books, he claimed, had directed him to remote places where strange survivals were hidden, survivors from eons and life cycles predating mankind. In some cases, these were connected to other dimensions and other worlds, with which communication was frequent in forgotten pre-human days. Jones marveled at the imagination that could conjure such notions and wondered about Rogers' mental history. Had his work amidst the morbid grotesqueries of Madame Tussauds initiated his imaginative flights, or was the tendency innate, making his choice of occupation merely one of its manifestations? At any rate, the man's work was very closely linked with his notions. Even now, there was no mistaking the trend of his blackest hints about the nightmare monstrosities in the screened-off, adults-only alcove. Heedless of ridicule, he was implying that not all of these demonic abnormalities were artificial. It was Jones's frank skepticism and amusement at these irresponsible claims that broke the growing cordiality. Rogers, it was clear, took himself very seriously. He became morose and resentful, tolerating Jones only through a stubborn urge to break down his wall of urbane and complacent incredulity. Wild tales and suggestions of rites and sacrifices to nameless elder gods continued. Now and then, Rogers would lead his guest to one of the hideous blasphemies in the screened-off alcove and point out features difficult to reconcile with even the finest human craftsmanship. Jones continued his visits out of sheer fascination, though he knew he had forfeited his host's regard. At times, he would try to humor Rogers with pretended assent to some mad hint or assertion, but the gaunt showman was seldom deceived by such tactics. The tension came to a head later in September. Jones had casually dropped into the museum one afternoon and was wandering through the dim corridors, whose horrors were now so familiar, when he heard a very peculiar sound from the general direction of Rogers' workroom. Others heard it too and started nervously as the echoes reverberated through the great vaulted basement. The three attendants exchanged odd glances. One of them, a dark, taciturn, foreign-looking fellow who always served Rogers as a repairer and assistant designer, smiled in a way that seemed to puzzle his colleagues and grated harshly on Jones's sensibilities. It was the yelp or scream of a dog, a sound that could only be made under conditions of utmost fright and agony combined. Its stark, anguished frenzy was appalling, and in this setting of grotesque abnormality, it held a double hideousness. Jones remembered that no dogs were allowed in the museum. He was about to go to the door leading into the workroom when the dark attendant stopped him with a word and a gesture. "Mr. Rogers," the man said in a soft, somewhat accented voice, at once apologetic and vaguely sardonic, was out. There were standing orders to admit no one to the workroom during his absence. As for that yelp, it was undoubtedly something in the courtyard behind the museum. This neighborhood was full of stray mongrels, and their fights were sometimes shockingly noisy. There were no dogs in any part of the museum. But if Mr. Jones wished to see Mr. Rogers, he might find him just before closing time. After this, Jones climbed the old stone steps to the street outside and curiously examined the squalid neighborhood. The leaning, decrepit buildings, once dwellings but now largely shops and warehouses, were very ancient indeed. Some were of a gabled type, seemingly dating back to Tudor times, and a faint, unhealthy stench subtly hung about the whole region. Beside the dingy house whose basement held the museum was a low archway pierced by a dark, cobbled alley. Jones entered this, vaguely wishing to find the courtyard behind the workroom and settle the dog incident more comfortably in his mind. The courtyard was dim in the late afternoon light, hemmed in by rear walls even uglier and more intangibly menacing than the crumbling street facades of the evil old houses. Not a dog was in sight, and Jones wondered how the aftermath of such frantic turmoil could have completely vanished so soon. Despite the assistant's statement that no dog had been in the museum, Jones glanced nervously at the 3 small windows of the basement workroom. They were narrow horizontal rectangles close to the grass-grown pavement, with grimy panes that stared repulsively and incuriously like the eyes of dead fish. To their left, a worn flight of steps led to an opaque and heavily bolted door. Some impulse urged him to crouch low on the damp, broken cobblestones and peer in, on the chance that the thick green shades, worked by long cords that hung down to a reachable level, might not be drawn. The outer surfaces were thick with dirt, but as he rubbed them with his handkerchief, he saw there was no obscuring curtain in the way of his vision. The cellar was so shadowed from the inside that not much could be made out, but the grotesque working paraphernalia now and then loomed up spectrally as Jones tried each of the windows in turn. It seemed evident at first that no one was within. Yet, when he peered through the extreme right-hand window, the one nearest the entrance alley, he saw a glow of light at the farther end of the apartment, which made him pause in bewilderment. There was no reason for any light to be there. It was the inner side of the room, and he could not recall any gas or electric fixture near that point. Another look defined the glow as a large vertical rectangle, and a thought occurred to him. It was in that direction that he had always noticed the heavy plank door with the abnormally large padlock. The door which was never opened, and above which was crudely smeared that hideous, cryptic symbol from the fragmentary records of forbidden elder magic. It must be open now, and there was a light inside. All his former speculations as to where that door led, and what lay behind it, were now renewed with trebly disquieting force. Jones wandered aimlessly around the dismal locality until close to 6 o'clock, when he returned to the museum to call on Rogers. He could hardly tell why he wished so especially to see the man just then, but there must have been some subconscious misgivings about that terribly unplaceable canine scream of the afternoon, and about the glow of light in that disturbing and usually unopened inner doorway with the heavy padlock. The attendants were leaving as he arrived, and he thought that Orabona, the dark, foreign-looking assistant, eyed him with something like sly, repressed amusement. He did not relish that look even though he had seen the fellow turn it on his employer many times. The vaulted exhibition room was ghoulish in its desertion, but he strode quickly through it and rapped at the door of the office and workroom. Response was slow in coming, though there were footsteps inside. Finally, in response to a second knock, the lock rattled, and the ancient 6-paneled portal creaked reluctantly open to reveal the slouching, feverish-eyed form of George Rogers. From the first, it was clear that the showman was in an unusual mood. There was a curious mixture of reluctance and actual gloating in his welcome, and his talk at once veered to extravagances of the most hideous and incredible sort. Surviving elder gods, nameless sacrifices, the non-artificial nature of some of the alcove horrors, all the usual boasts, but uttered in a tone of peculiarly increasing confidence. Obviously, Jones reflected, the poor fellow's madness was gaining on him. From time to time, Rogers would send furtive glances toward the heavy, padlocked inner door at the end of the room, or toward a piece of coarse burlap on the floor not far from it, beneath which some small object appeared to be lying. Jones grew more nervous as the moments passed and began to feel as hesitant about mentioning the afternoon's oddities as he had formerly been anxious to do so. Rogers' sepulchrally resonant bass almost cracked under the excitement of his fevered rambling. "Do you remember," he shouted, "what I told you about that ruined city in Indochina where the Chochos lived? You had to admit I'd been there when you saw the photographs, even if you did think I made that oblong swimmer in darkness out of wax. If you'd seen it writhing in the underground pools as I did. Well, this is bigger still. I never told you about this because I wanted to work out the later parts before making any claim. When you see the snapshots, you'll know the geography couldn't have been faked. And I fancy I have another way of proving that it isn't any wax concoction of mine. You've never seen it, for the experiments wouldn't let me keep it on exhibition." The showman glanced queerly at the padlocked door. "It all comes from that long ritual in the 8th Nakadic fragment. When I got it figured out, I saw it could have only one meaning. There were things in the north before the land of Lomar, before mankind existed, and this was one of them. It took us all the way to Alaska and up the Noatak from Fort Morton. But the thing was there as we knew it would be. Great cyclopean ruins, acres of them. There was less left than we had hoped for, but after 3 million years, what could one expect? And weren't the Eskimo legends all in the right direction? We couldn't get one of the beggars to go with us and had to sledge all the way back to Nome for Americans. Orabona was no good in that climate, it made him sullen and hateful. I'll tell you later how we found it. When we got the ice blasted out of the pylons of the central ruin, the stairway was just as we knew it would be. Some carvings were still there, and it was no trouble keeping the Yankees from following us in. Orabona shivered like a leaf. You'd never think it from the damned insolent way he struts around here. He knew enough of the elder lore to be properly afraid. The eternal light was gone, but our torches showed enough. We saw the bones of others who had been before us, eons ago when the climate was warm. Some of these bones were things you couldn't even imagine. At the 3rd level down, we found the ivory throne the fragments said so much about, and I may as well tell you it wasn't empty. The thing on that throne didn't move, and we knew then that it needed the nourishment of sacrifice. But we didn't want to wake it then. Better to get it to London first. Orabona and I went to the surface for the big box, but when we had packed it, we couldn't get it up the 3 flights of steps. These steps weren't made for human beings and their size bothered us. Anyway, it was devilishly heavy. We had to have the Americans down to get it out. They weren't anxious to go into the place, but of course the worst thing was safely inside the box. We told them it was a batch of ivory carvings, archaeological stuff, and after seeing the carved throne they probably believed us. It's a wonder they didn't suspect hidden treasure and demand a share. They must have told queer tales around Nome later on, though I doubt if they ever went back to those ruins even for the ivory throne. Rogers paused, rummaged in his desk, and produced an envelope of good-sized photographic prints. He extracted one, laying it face down before him, and handed the rest to Jones. The set was certainly odd. Ice-clad hills, dog sledges, men in furs, and vast, tumbled ruins against a snowy background. The bizarre outlines and enormous stone blocks of the ruins were almost inexplicable. One flashlight view showed an incredible interior chamber with wild carvings and a curious throne, whose proportions clearly weren't designed for a human occupant. The carvings on the gigantic masonry, high walls and peculiar vaulting overhead, were mainly symbolic. They included both wholly unknown designs and certain hieroglyphs darkly cited in obscene legends. Above the throne loomed the same dreadful symbol now painted on the workroom wall above the padlocked plank door. Jones darted a nervous glance at the closed portal. Assuredly, Rogers had been to strange places and seen strange things. Yet, this mad interior picture could easily be a fraud, taken from a very clever stage setting. One must not be too credulous. But Rogers continued. Well, we shipped the box from Nome and got to London without any trouble. That was the first time we'd ever brought back anything that had a chance of coming alive. I didn't put it on display because there were more important things to do for it. It needed the nourishment of sacrifice, for it was a god. Of course, I couldn't get the sort of sacrifices it used to have in its day, for such things don't exist now. But there were other things which I might do. Blood is life, you know. Even the lemurs and elementals that are older than the earth will come when the blood of men or beasts is offered under the right conditions. The expression on Roger's face was growing very alarming and repulsive, so Jones fidgeted involuntarily in his chair. Rogers seemed to notice his guest's nervousness and continued with a distinctly evil smile. It was last year that I got it, and ever since then I've been trying rites and sacrifices. Orabona hasn't been much help, for he was always against the idea of waking it. He hates it, probably because he's afraid of what it will come to mean. He carries a pistol all the time to protect himself, fool, as if there were human protection against it. If I ever see him draw that pistol, I'll strangle him. He wanted me to kill it and make an effigy of it. But I've stuck by my plans, and I'm coming out on top in spite of all the cowards like Orabona and damn sniggering skeptics like you, Jones. I've chanted the rites and made certain sacrifices, and last week the transition came. The sacrifice was received and enjoyed. Rogers actually licked his lips, while Jones held himself uneasily rigid. The showman paused and rose, crossing the room to the piece of burlap at which he had glanced so often. Bending down, he took hold of one corner as he spoke again. You've laughed enough at my work, now it's time for you to get some facts. Orabona tells me you heard a dog screaming around here this afternoon. Do you know what that meant? Jones started. For all his curiosity, he would have been glad to get out without further light on the point that had so puzzled him. But Rogers was inexorable and began to lift the square of burlap. Beneath it lay a crushed, almost shapeless mass, which Jones was slow to classify. Was it a once-living thing that some agency had flattened, sucked dry of blood, punctured in 1,000 places, and wrung into a limp, broken-boned heap of grotesqueness? After a moment, Jones realized what it must be. It was what was left of a dog perhaps of considerable size and whitish color. Its breed was past recognition, for distortion had come in nameless and hideous ways. Most of the hair was burned off as by some pungent acid, and the exposed, bloodless skin was riddled by innumerable circular wounds or incisions. The form of torture necessary to cause such results was past imagining. Electrified with a pure loathing that conquered his mounting disgust, Jones sprang up with a cry. You damned sadist, you madman, you do a thing like this and dare to speak to a decent man. Rogers dropped the burlap with a malignant sneer and faced his oncoming guest. His words held an unnatural calm. Why, you fool, do you think I did this? Let us admit that the results are unbeautiful from our limited human standpoint. What of it? It is not human and does not pretend to be. To sacrifice is merely to offer. I gave the dog to it. What happened is its work, not mine. It needed the nourishment of the offering and took it in its own way. But let me show you what it looks like. As Jones stood hesitating, the speaker returned to his desk and took up the photograph he had laid face down without showing. Now he extended it with a curious look. Jones took it and glanced at it in an almost mechanical way. After a moment, the visitor's glance became sharper and more absorbed, for the utterly satanic force of the object depicted had an almost hypnotic effect. Certainly, Rogers had outdone himself in modeling the eldritch nightmare that the camera had caught. The thing was a work of sheer, infernal genius, and Jones wondered how the public would react when it was placed on exhibition. So hideous a thing had no right to exist. Probably the mere contemplation of it, after it was done, had completed the unhinging of its maker's mind and led him to worship it with brutal sacrifices. Only a stout sanity could resist the insidious suggestion that the blasphemy was, or had once been, some morbid and exotic form of actual life. The thing in the picture squatted or was balanced on what appeared to be a clever reproduction of the monstrously carved throne in the other curious photograph. To describe it with any ordinary vocabulary would be impossible, for nothing even roughly corresponding to it has ever come within the imagination of sane mankind. It represented something meant perhaps to be roughly connected with the vertebrates of this planet, though one could not be too sure of that. Its bulk was cyclopean, for even squatting, It towered to almost twice the height of Orabona, who was shown beside it. Looking sharply, one might trace its approximations toward the bodily features of the higher vertebrates. There was an almost globular torso, with 6 long, sinuous limbs terminating in crab-like claws. From the upper end, a subsidiary globe bulged forward bubble-like, its triangle of 3 staring, fishy eyes, its foot-long and evidently flexible proboscis, and a distended lateral system analogous to gills, suggesting that it was a head. Most of the body was covered with what at first appeared to be fur, but which on closer examination proved to be a dense growth of dark, slender tentacles or sucking filaments, each tipped with a mouth suggesting the head of an asp. On the head and below the proboscis, the tentacles tended to be longer and thicker, and marked with spiral stripes, suggesting the traditional serpent locks of Medusa. To say that such a thing could have an expression seems paradoxical. Yet Jones felt that that triangle of bulging fish eyes and that obliquely poised proboscis all bespoke a blend of hate, greed, and sheer cruelty incomprehensible to mankind because mixed with other emotions not of this world or this solar system. Into this bestial abnormality, he reflected, Rogers must have poured at once all his malignant insanity and all his uncanny sculptural genius. The thing was incredible, and yet the photograph proved that it existed. Rogers interrupted his reveries. Well, what do you think of it? Now do you wonder what crushed the dog and sucked it dry with a million mouths? It needed nourishment, and it will need more. It is a god, and I am the first priest of its latter-day hierarchy. Shub-Niggurath, the goat with 1,000 young. Jones lowered the photograph in disgust and pity. See here, Rogers, this won't do. There are limits, you know. It's a great piece of work and all that, but it isn't good for you. Better not see it anymore. Let Orabona break it up and try to forget about it. And let me tear this beastly picture up too. With a snarl, Rogers snatched the photograph and returned it to the desk. Idiot, you, and you still think it's all a fraud. You still think I made it, and you still think my figures are nothing but lifeless wax. Why, damn you, you're a worse cold than a wax image of yourself. But I've got proof this time, and you're going to know. Not just now, for it is resting after the sacrifice, but later. Oh yes, you will not doubt the power of it then. As Rogers glanced toward the padlocked inner door, Jones retrieved his hat and stick from a nearby bench. Very well, Rogers, let it be later. I must be going now, but I'll call around tomorrow afternoon. Think my advice over and see if it doesn't sound sensible. Ask Orabona what he thinks too. Rogers actually bared his teeth in wild beast fashion. Must be going now, eh? Afraid after all. Afraid for all your bold talk. You say the effigies are only wax, and yet you run away when I begin to prove that they aren't. You're like the fellows who take my standing bet that they daren't spend the night in the museum. They come boldly enough, but after an hour they shriek and hammer to get out. Want me to ask Orabona, eh? You two always against me. You want to break down the coming earthly reign of it. Jones preserved his calm. No, Rogers, there's nobody against you. And I'm not afraid of your figures either, much as I admire your skill. But we're both a bit nervous tonight, and I fancy some rest will do us good. Again Rogers checked his guest's departure. Not afraid, eh? Then why are you so anxious to go? Look here, do you or don't you dare to stay alone here in the dark? What's your hurry if you don't believe in it? Some new idea seemed to have struck Rogers, and Jones eyed him closely. Why, I'm in no special hurry, but what would be gained by my staying here alone? What would it prove? My only objection is that it isn't very comfortable for sleeping. What good would it do either of us? This time it was Jones who was struck with an idea. He continued in a tone of conciliation. See here, Rogers, I've just asked you what it would prove if I stayed when we both know. It would prove that your effigies are just effigies, and that you oughtn't to let your imagination go the way it's been going lately. Suppose I do stay. If I stick it out till morning, will you agree to take a new view of things? Go on a vacation for 3 months or so and let Orabona destroy that new thing of yours? Come now, isn't that fair? The expression on the showman's face was hard to read. It was obvious that he was thinking quickly, and that of sundry conflicting emotions, malign triumph was getting the upper hand. His voice held a choking quality as he replied. Fair enough. If you do stick it out, I'll take your advice. But stick to it. We'll go out for dinner and come back. I'll lock you in the display room and go home. In the morning I'll come down ahead of Orabona. He comes half an hour before the rest, and see how you are. But don't try it unless you are very sure of your skepticism. Others have backed out, you have that chance. And I suppose a pounding on the outer door would always bring a constable. You may not like it so well after a while. You'll be in the same building though not in the same room with it. As they left the rear door into the dingy courtyard, Rogers took with him the piece of burlap, weighted with a gruesome burden. Near the center of the court was a manhole, whose cover the showman lifted quietly, and with a shudder some suggestion of familiarity. Burlap and all, the burden went down to the oblivion of a cloacal labyrinth. Jones shuddered and almost shrank from the gaunt figure at his side as they emerged into the street. By unspoken mutual consent, they did not dine together but agreed to meet in front of the museum at 11. Jones hailed a cab and breathed more freely when he had crossed Waterloo Bridge and was approaching the brilliantly lighted Strand. He dined at a quiet cafe and subsequently went to his home in Portland Place to bathe and get a few things. Idly he wondered what Rogers was doing. He had heard that the man had a vast, dismal house in Walworth Road, full of obscure and forbidden books, occult paraphernalia, and wax images that he did not choose to place on exhibition. Orabona, he understood, lived in separate quarters in the same house. At 11, Jones found Rogers waiting by the basement door in Southwark Street. Their words were few, but each seemed taut with a menacing tension. They agreed that the vaulted exhibition room alone should form the scene of the vigil, and Rogers did not insist that the watcher sit in the special adult alcove of supreme horrors. The showman, having extinguished all the lights with switches in the workroom, locked the door of that crypt with one of the keys on his crowded ring. Without shaking hands, he passed out the street door, locked it after him, and stamped up the worn steps to the sidewalk outside. As his tread receded, Jones realized that the long, tedious vigil had commenced. Chapter 2. Later, in the utter blackness of the great arched cellar, Jones cursed the childish naivete that had brought him there. For the first half hour he kept flashing his pocket light at intervals. But now, just sitting in the dark on one of the visitors' benches has become more nerve-wracking. Every time the beam shot out, it lit up some morbid, grotesque object. A guillotine, a nameless hybrid monster, a pasty-bearded face crafty with evil, a body with red torrents streaming from a severed throat. Jones knew that no sinister reality was attached to these things, but after that first half hour, he preferred not to see them. Why he had bothered to humor that madman he could scarcely imagine. It would have been much simpler merely to have left him alone or to have called in a mental specialist. Probably, he reflected, it was the fellow feeling of one artist for another. There was so much genius in Rogers that he deserved every possible chance to be helped quietly out of his growing mania. Any man who could imagine and construct the incredibly lifelike things that he had produced was surely not far from actual greatness. He had the fancy of a cyme or a door, joined to the minute scientific craftsmanship of a Blashka. Indeed, he had done for the world of nightmare what the Blashkas, with their marvelously accurate plant models of finely wrought and colored glass, had done for the world of botany. At midnight, the strokes of a distant clock filtered through the darkness, and Jones felt cheered by the message from a still surviving outside world. The vaulted museum chamber was like a tomb, ghastly in its utter solitude. Even a mouse would be cheering for the company. Yet Rogers had once boasted that, for certain reasons, as he said, no mice or even insects ever came near the place. That was very curious, yet it seemed to be true. The deadness and silence were virtually complete. If only something would make a sound. He shuffled his feet, and the echoes came spectrally out of the absolute stillness. He coughed, but there was something mocking in the staccato reverberations. He could not, he vowed, begin talking to himself. That meant nervous disintegration. Time seemed to pass with abnormal and disconcerting slowness. He could have sworn that hours had elapsed since he last flashed the light on his watch, yet here was only the stroke of midnight. He wished that his senses were not so preternaturally keen. Something in the darkness and stillness seemed to have sharpened them, so that they responded to faint intimations hardly strong enough to be called true impressions. His ears seemed at times to catch a faint, elusive rustling which could not quite be identified with the nocturnal hum of the squalid streets outside. He thought of vague, irrelevant things like the music of the spheres and the unknown, inaccessible life of alien dimensions pressing on our own. Rogers often speculated about such things. The floating specks of light in his darkness-drowned eyes seemed inclined to take on curious symmetries of pattern and motion. He had often wondered about those strange rays from the unplumbed abyss which scintillate before us in the absence of all earthly illumination, but he had never known any that behaved just as these were behaving. They lacked the restful aimlessness of ordinary light specks, suggesting some will and purpose remote from any terrestrial conception. Then there was that suggestion of odd stirrings. Nothing was open, yet in spite of the general draftlessness, Jones felt that the air was not uniformly quiet. There were intangible variations in pressure, not quite decided enough to suggest the loathsome pawings of unseen elementals. It was abnormally chilly too. He did not like any of this. The air tasted salty as if it were mixed with the brine of dark subterranean waters, and there was a bare hint of some odor of ineffable mustiness. In the daytime he had never noticed that the waxen figures had an odor. Even now that half-received hint was not the way wax figures ought to smell. It was more like the faint smell of specimens in a natural history museum. Curious, in view of Rogers' claims that his figures were not all artificial. Indeed, it was probably that claim which made one's imagination conjure up the olfactory suspicion. One must guard against excesses of the imagination. Had not such things driven poor Rogers mad? But the utter loneliness of this place was frightful. Even the distant chimes seemed to come from across cosmic gulfs. It made Jones think of that insane picture which Rogers had shown him, the wildly carved chamber with the cryptic throne, which the fellow had claimed was part of a 3-million-year-old ruin in the shunned and inaccessible solitudes of the Arctic. Perhaps Rogers had been to Alaska, but that picture was certainly nothing but stage scenery. It couldn't normally be otherwise with all that carving and those terrible symbols. And that monstrous shape supposed to have been found on that throne, what a flight of diseased fancy. Jones wondered just how far he actually was from the insane masterpiece in wax. Probably it was kept behind that heavy, padlocked plank door leading somewhere out of the workroom. But it would never do to brood about a waxen image. Wasn't the present room full of such things, some of them scarcely less horrible than the dreadful IT? And beyond a thin canvas screen on the left was the adults-only alcove with its nameless phantoms of delirium. The proximity of the numberless waxen shapes began to get on Jones's nerves more and more as the quarter hours wore on. He knew the museum so well that he could not get rid of their usual images even in the total darkness. Indeed, the darkness had the effect of adding to the remembered images certain very disturbing imaginative overtones. The guillotine seemed to creak, and the bearded face of Landru, slayer of his 50 wives, twisted itself into expressions of monstrous menace. From the severed throat of Madame de Mers, a hideous bubbling sound seemed to emanate, while the headless, legless victim of a trunk murder tried to edge closer and closer on its gory stumps. Jones began shutting his eyes to see if that would dim the images, but found it was useless. Besides, when he shut his eyes, the strange, purposeful patterns of light specks became more disturbingly pronounced. Then suddenly he began trying to keep the hideous images he had formerly been trying to banish. He tried to keep them because they were giving place to still more hideous ones. In spite of himself, his memory began reconstructing the utterly non-human blasphemies that lurked in the obscure corners, and these lumpish hybrid growths oozed and wriggled toward him as though hunting him down in a circle. Black Tsathoggua molded itself from a toad-like gargoyle to a long, sinuous line with hundreds of rudimentary feet, and a lean, rubbery night gaunt spread its wings as if to advance and smother the watcher. Jones braced himself to keep from screaming. He knew he was reverting to the traditional terrors of his childhood and resolved to use his adult reason to keep the phantoms at bay. It helped a bit, he found, to flash the light again. Frightful as were the images it showed, these were not as bad as what his fancy called out of the utter blackness. But there were drawbacks. Even in the light of his torch, he could not help supposing a slight, furtive trembling on the part of the canvas partition screening off the terrible adults-only alcove. He knew what lay beyond and shivered. Imagination called up the shocking form of fabulous Yog-Sothoth, only a collection of iridescent globes, yet stupendous in its malign suggestiveness. What was this accursed mass slowly floating toward him and bumping on the partition that stood in the way? A small bulge in the canvas far to the right suggested the sharp horn of Nofkich, the hairy myth-thing of the Greenland ice, that walked sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, and sometimes on 6. To get this stuff out of his head, Jones walked boldly toward the hellish alcove with his torch burning steadily. Of course, none of his fears were true. Yet were not the long facial tentacles of great Cthulhu actually swaying slowly and insidiously? He knew they were flexible, but he had not realized that the drought caused by his advance was enough to set them in motion. Returning to his former seat outside the alcove, he shut his eyes and let the symmetrical light specks do their worst. The distant clock boomed a single stroke. Could it be only 1? He flashed the light on his watch and saw that it was precisely that hour. It would be hard indeed waiting for morning. Rogers would be down at about 8 o'clock, ahead of even Orabona. It would be light outside in the main basement long before that, but none of it could penetrate here. All the windows in this basement had been bricked up but the 3 small ones facing the court. A pretty bad wait all told. His ears were getting most of the hallucinations now, for he could swear he heard stealthy, plodding footsteps in the workroom beyond the closed and locked door. He had no business thinking of that unexhibited horror which Rogers called it. The thing was a contamination. It had driven its maker mad, and now even its picture was calling up imaginative terrors. It could not be in the workroom. It was very obviously beyond that padlocked door of heavy planking. Those steps were certainly pure imagination. Then he thought he heard the key turn in the workroom door. Flashing on his torch, he saw nothing but the ancient 6-paneled portal in its proper position. Again he tried darkness and closed eyes, but there followed a harrowing illusion of creaking, not the guillotine this time but the slow, furtive opening of the workroom door. He would not scream. Once he screamed he would be lost. There was a sort of padding or shuffling audible now, and it was slowly advancing toward him. He must retain command of himself. Had he not done so when the nameless brain shapes tried to close in on him? The shuffling crept nearer and his resolution failed. He did not scream but merely gulped out a challenge. "Who goes there? Who are you? What do you want?" There was no answer, but the shuffling kept on. Jones did not know which he feared most to do, turn on his flashlight or stay in the dark while the thing crept upon him. This thing was different, he felt profoundly, from the other terrors of the evening. His fingers and throat worked spasmodically. Silence was impossible, and the suspense of utter blackness was beginning to be the most intolerable of all conditions. Again he cried out hysterically, "Halt! Who goes there?" as he switched on the revealing beams of his torch. Then, paralyzed by what he saw, he dropped the flashlight and screamed, not once but many times. Shuffling toward him in the darkness was the gigantic, blasphemous form of a black thing, not wholly ape and not wholly insect. Its hide hung loosely upon its frame, and its rugose, dead-eyed rudiment of a head swayed drunkenly from side to side. Its forepaws were extended, with talons spread wide, and its whole body was taut with murderous malignity despite its utter lack of facial expression. After the screams and the final coming of darkness, it leaped, and in a moment had Jones pinned to the floor. There was no struggle, for the watcher had fainted. Jones's fainting spell could not have lasted more than a moment, for the nameless thing was apishly dragging him through the darkness when he began recovering consciousness. What started him fully awake were the sounds which the thing was making, or rather, the voice with which it was making them. That voice was human and it was familiar. Only one living being could be behind the hoarse, feverish accents which were chanting to an unknown horror. It was howling. "I am coming, O Rantegith, coming with the nourishment. You have waited long and fed ill, but now you shall have what was promised. That and more, for instead of Orabona, it will be one of high degree who had doubted you. You shall crush and drain him with all his doubts and grow strong thereby. And ever after among men, he shall be shown as a monument to your glory. Rantegith, infinite and invincible, I am your slave and high priest. You are hungry and I provide. I read the sign and have led you forth. I shall feed you with blood, and you shall feed me with power. Shubnigurath, the goat with 1,000 young. In an instant, all the terrors of the night dropped from Jones like a discarded cloak. He was again master of his mind, for he knew the very earthly and material peril he had to deal with. This was no monster of a fable, but a dangerous madman. It was Rogers, dressed in some nightmare covering of his own insane designing, and about to make a frightful sacrifice to the devil god he had fashioned out of wax. Clearly, he must have entered the workroom from the rear courtyard, donned his disguise, and then advanced to seize his neatly trapped and fear-broken victim. His strength was prodigious, and if he was to be thwarted, one must act quickly. Counting on the madman's confidence in his unconsciousness, he determined to take him by surprise while his grasp was relatively lax. The feel of a threshold told him he was crossing into the pitch-black workroom. With the strength of mortal fear, Jones made a sudden spring from the half-recumbent posture in which he was being dragged. For an instant, he was free of the astonished maniac's hands, and in another instant, a lucky lunge in the dark had put his own hands at his captor's weirdly concealed throat. Simultaneously, Rogers gripped him again, and without further preliminaries, the two were locked in a desperate struggle of life and death. Jones's athletic training, without doubt, was his sole salvation, for his mad assailant, freed from every inhibition of fair play, decency, or even self-preservation, was an engine of savage destruction as formidable as a wolf or panther. Guttural cries sometimes punctured the hideous tussle in the dark. Blood spurted, clothing ripped, and Jones at last felt the actual throat of the maniac shorn of its spectral mask. He spoke not a word but put every ounce of energy into the defense of his life. Rogers kicked, gouged, butted, bit, clawed, and spat, yet found strength to yelp out actual sentences at times. Most of his speech was in a ritualistic jargon full of references to it or Rantegeth, and to Jones's overwrought nerves, it seemed as if the cries echoed from an infinite distance of demoniac snortings and bayings. Toward the last, they were rolling on the floor, overturning benches or striking against the walls and the brick foundations of the central melting furnace. Up to the very end, Jones could not be certain of saving himself, but chance finally intervened in his favor. A jab of his knee against Rogers' chest produced a general relaxation, and a moment later, he knew he had won. Though hardly able to hold himself up, Jones rose and stumbled about the walls seeking the light switch, for his flashlight was gone, together with most of his clothing. As he lurched along, he dragged his limp opponent with him, fearing a sudden attack when the madman came to. Finding the switch box, he fumbled till he had the right handle. Then, as the wildly disordered workroom burst into sudden radiance, he set about binding Rogers with such cords and belts as he could easily find. The fellow's disguise, or what was left of it, seems to be made of a puzzlingly queer sort of leather. For some reason, it made Jones's flesh crawl to touch it, and there seemed to be an alien rusty odor about it. In the normal clothes beneath it was Rogers' keyring, and this the exhausted victor seized as his final passport to freedom. The shades at the small slit-like windows were all securely drawn, and he let them remain so. Washing off the blood of battle at a convenient sink, Jones donned the most ordinary-looking and least ill-fitting clothes he could find on the costume hooks. Testing the door to the courtyard, he found it fastened with a spring lock which did not require a key from the inside. He kept the keyring, however, to admit him on his return with aid, for plainly the thing to do was to call in an alienist. There was no telephone in the museum, but it would not take long to find an all-night restaurant or chemist's shop where one could be had. He had almost opened the door to go when a torrent of hideous abuse from across the room told him that Rogers, whose visible injuries were confined to a long, deep scratch down the left cheek, had regained consciousness. Full. Spawn of Nothyidik and effluvium of Cthulhu. Son of the dogs that howl in the maelstrom of Azathoth. You would have been sacred and immortal, and now you are betraying it and its priest. Beware, for it is hungry. It would have been Orabona, that damn treacherous dog ready to turn against me and it, but I give you the first honor instead. Now you must both beware, for it is not gentle without its priest.